Welcome to Coastal Front. Join us each week as we sit down with the movers and shakers of Vancouver to discuss stories of business, politics, accomplishment, and failure. Our aim is to keep you dialed into what matters most in our city. Now, here's your host, Andrew Johns.
Great. Okay, I'm so excited to have you here. David Eby, Attorney General of British Columbia, a friend of mine. We got to know each other years ago when you were supporting my campaign to change Family Day.
Congratulations, by the way.
Well,
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, it was. And we got to know each other really well over the years. I was supportive in your campaign to run in our local riding. I was happy to vote for you, and so was my wife. And now you got this big responsibility as Attorney General. But we're not going to talk about some of those things you've been touching on. I mean, it could go on forever. We talk about ICBC and BC Hydro, but today I want to kind of talk about some of the things that are kind of near and dear to both my heart, and I know some of the residents that live in the community that we both live in. And so we're going to start with talking about the speculation and vacancy tax.
Sure.
And then if we have time, we'll dive into the school tax and this upcoming. Definitely want to finish off with the public registry. Mm-hmm. Now. The first thing with the vacancy and speculation vacancy tax, how do you think it's been going so far? Like, are you happy with the results? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, it's an incredible challenge to bring in a tax like this. It's something that hasn't been done before. Mm-hmm. So usually Ministry of Finance look at, okay, another jurisdiction did something like this, and this is quite new. And the interesting thing about it is that it really aims to target a specific cost that's imposed on the province by a certain type of investment, and namely that's investment in real estate. And that investment brings with it all kinds of externalities, including an escalation in the price of real estate, a lowered vacancy rate when people feel like their property's worth more if nobody lives in it and rents it. And so attempts to put a bit of a price on that and discourage that kind of behavior in our real estate market. So in the sense that it's achieving some of the goals right out of the gate, I'm happy about it.
Yeah.
And in the sense that it's a brand new initiative without precedent, I think it's gone well. Which is not to say it's been perfect and nobody expected it would be. So it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
And we've seen, I think we're probably in 1.3 now in terms of
version 1.3.
Version 1.3.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk about version 1.0 versus version 1.2, which was, and I want to dive into the areas. So we've got a map on here, and when this was first sort of socialized publicly, there were a lot of additional regions, like all the Gulf Islands were included, Parksville area of Parksville, Lions Bay, Bowen Island, and rightfully, in my view, there was a lot of pushback from some of these communities, and I think also rightfully, the NDP made a good correction on a number of these locations. I mean, Gulf Islands is, even if they have a low vacancy rate, it's not like a place that I think people tend to speculate on. So I think that was a smart move. Now, one of the particular comments or questions I have, if you have a view on this, is Whistler. Now, Whistler is a community with extremely low vacancy. I mean, there's tons of vacant homes, but it's really hard to rent them. I got friends that work up there in this, and they've actually had to create in the town of Whistler a separate market for what they call, I don't know what it's called, but the idea is it's for residents of Whistler, and it's not market priced homes. It's on a different scale, only available to residents of Whistler. Any idea why the NDP government didn't ever include and still hasn't included Whistler in this equation?
Yeah, I think any municipality that where the elected representatives would like for the community to be included, certainly they should make that known to the Minister of Finance.
Yeah.
I wasn't part of the discussions about which community it would be applied to and which it wouldn't, but I would say that Whistler's kind of unique, and so are areas like Sun Peaks and other resort municipalities, in that their model is built on selling real estate to tourists that come and ski and engage in that kind of activity.
Sure, that
and
makes sense.
It's a bit of the business model of that community, and it is a distinction between Whistler and really any other municipality in the province. Whistler does have a very serious housing crisis, so does Tofino. And a number of other tourist-dependent communities where people who work in the industry just can't afford to live there.
Right.
And Vancouver sees that too.
Yeah.
And so it's a challenge that government's very engaged with, including through municipality or Ministry of Tourism.
Yeah.
And one of the initiatives that they've brought forward is allowing municipalities to use some of the hotel tax to build worker housing in those communities to deal with some of that it is I would say more of a challenge in a community like Whistler that has a business model of selling real estate to pay for the resort amenity.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Now, I'm not a skier, as you know. It's one of the reasons why I was starkly against the whole differentiating of the family day.
I didn't realize that was an anti-skiing initiative.
Well, it wasn't anti-skiing, but I mean, it was definitely the ski community that lobbied the Liberal government to have it as a different weekend. Sun Peaks is in the Okanagan, right? I mean, Ross, you ski there, right?
Is
it Kelowna?
No, that's Kelowna's Big White.
Big White.
Sun Peaks is past Merritt, I believe.
Okay,
yeah.
but if you look at Big White, so is Big White, because Kelowna's in this community, is
Yes,
Big
it is.
White residents of Big White? Are they?
I don't believe it is. I think it's Urban Kelowna.
Urban Kelowna. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Okay, so same premise. The NDP kept the Big White out of that because obviously it'd be pretty hard for people to rent out.
I'd like to say that's absolutely true. I don't know that for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the other ones that came to my and I guess again, this is not your ministry, of course, but one of the other ones that really came to my attention, because we did a podcast last week with the mayor of Belcarra, and so Belcarra is like you've got Maple Ridge, then you've got Anmore, and then you've got the small little community of Belcarra, and there's about 28 families there who have like these multi-generation cabins that many of are water access, and they're still included. There's no public transit in Belcarra. They're still included in this. And so some of these homes have, assessed values over $1 million. One that Neil, the mayor, talked about in particular was valued at like $1.3 million. And the home is water access only, and you can't even call it a home. Like, it's such a decrepit old cabin that was built 60 years ago. Yet the owners of that are now being required to pay this vacancy tax. And there's very few people that commute from Belcarra into Vancouver, yet Lions Bay, which is a much larger community, they were in the version 1.0, and now they're not in version 1.1. They got excluded, as well as Bowen Island. Do you have any thoughts around, why would a community like Belcarra not be excluded, but a community like Lions Bay would?
Yeah, so I know the Ministry of Finance is in conversation with a number of the mayors, and that the Minister of Finance has a meeting coming up with the mayors. It was one of the commitments she made when the tax came in, was that she would sit down with them after a year to see what the impacts and implications are. I mean, I've seen a number of those properties in Belcarra, and I wouldn't describe them as cabins.
Yeah.
But maybe I have a different perspective. I think that the mayor of Belcarra has done a very effective job of advocating on this issue for his community from his perspective, and the advocacy needs to be directed at the Minister of Finance in terms of why Belcarra is included and why it's part of the initiative.
Okay. So no real view on that yourself, a little bit outside of your...
I'm afraid I don't know enough about Belcarra or the process the Ministry of Finance followed, but I do know that Belcarra is located squarely in the Lower Mainland, where the tax applies to everybody else.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's dial it back to our own community.
Sure.
One of the other things that I've noticed in my area where I live, and is there's a lot of empty homes, and so I've been generally supportive of the concept, as you've known for years. I mean, way before you guys came into power in Victoria, back when you and I and Tom Davidoff were talking, and I really liked the concept of their model, which was to tie this to income that's been earned and taxes paid on that income, so that people who have contributed over the years, maybe have a little bit of leeway, and people who've come in, foreign people maybe who've never put a penny in tax into this province would have to pay. My neighborhood, David, as I've probably told you before, is full of empty homes, and I know I get a sense of who some of the owners are. I mean, I don't know them personally, but we find out just kind of through the few neighbors that do actually live there. And what I've noticed is most of these homes are still empty. One of the questions I have is, look, I'm not really the kind of guy that wants to go around squealing on my neighbors. It's not necessarily the most friendly way to generate, goodwill with your neighbors. But at the same time, look, I'm a hardworking Canadian, pay a ton of tax in this country. And if I've got a foreign owner, which I do actually have one on the right of me, one on the left of me, and one right in front of me, so they're all in front, all around me, and I'm pretty sure they're not contributing to the society like I am. I don't mind, highlighting that to the province, but I don't know if the province is doing anything about it. There's no whistleblower program, and maybe even in your part of our community, you might see the same thing. So how do you know? I mean, you might know because you're in government now, but how do I know that the province of BC is attending to these homes, because some of them, David, I'm pretty sure they're even paying people to kind of like make it look like it's lived in. But I mean, there's a house down the street, and the telltale sign for me was you remember near just after Christmas, we had that kind of that snowy period that was longer than most of us British Columbians are used to, and there was snow on the ground for like 10 days, and there was no footprints of any type going into that house. I mean, it could have been away for Christmas, but this house we've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years. No one has ever come in and out of this house once. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is the nice part about the speculation tax is for the first time, the Ministry of Finance has connected social insurance numbers to the ownership of specific properties. So for the first time, the government theoretically knows, you declared an income of $5,000, $12,000, and you purchased a house that was $4 million. It's a flag for Revenue Canada in terms of lifestyle audit. It's a flag for British Columbia in terms of benefits that people may be receiving for low-income people. Yeah. And it's a flag if you're declaring that you're not a satellite family. And I think that's what you're describing when you talk about foreign. And the important piece for me on that was really that it not be based on citizenship or permanent residency, because first of all, as a practical matter, you can buy citizenship in Canada. People may not know that, but you can buy citizenship. You buy it through Quebec, and you can become a Canadian citizen. And so it's not really a good measure. And what a good measure is are you paying your taxes in British Columbia, in Canada? And the text very clearly says if you're a satellite family, which means that regardless of your nationality, citizenship, or otherwise, if you're earning the majority of your income outside of Canada and you're not paying taxes in Canada, then you have to pay the speculation tax. And it's not an insignificant tax. It's 2% on the assessed value of the property. Yeah.
For non-Canadians. Yeah.
For satellite families.
Yeah, for satellite families.
And so it's specifically aimed at that. And what it's aimed at doing is closing that gap in terms of, you're competing for real estate with people who don't pay the level of income tax that you do in their home jurisdiction where they're declaring their income. Yeah. So it shouldn't work that you get the benefit of the social services and the schools and the hospitals and the police, rule of law, good roads, street lights, all these kinds of things, and you live here while declaring your income in a jurisdiction that doesn't have any of those things because they have such a low tax rate. Right. And then you bring that money in to compete in the real estate market against someone that's paying the high tax rate that pays for all those services. Right. Just fundamentally unfair. Yeah. And so it's aimed at closing that gap between those things. Yeah. And it's the first attempt, amazingly, it's the first attempt that any government that I'm aware of in Canada has made to connect real estate purchasing with actually a specific individual, and I hope we talk about the beneficial ownership registry. Yeah, we're going with a real person that has a social insurance number, and then enables Revenue Canada as well to do those lifestyle audits, which they should be doing on this.
Should be, yeah. Yeah, I guess you got to lean on them a lot for their part of in this.
Yeah, and we have been, and the feds have said, we've got $160-ish million over 5 years to increase enforcement around money laundering and do more lifestyle audits at a Revenue Canada. They haven't deployed any of that money yet. So as far as I know, things are about the same level in terms of that enforcement. Yeah. But they have got some resources that they say they're going to deploy. So we'll see.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have a pretty critical view of CRA.
We see them chase the waitresses for the tips. We see them chase the small businesses for this or that. And then in the meantime, what about what's happening here in the real estate market? Drives me crazy too.
I'm drinking your Kool-Aid right now on that one. Yeah. I mean, I'm in my 10th and 13 years of audits. I've never had a bad. They've always most of the time they end up giving me money back. Yet they're not chasing after. And let's go back to it. So I understand the spirit. It's great. You gave a good summary. I love the idea. Because I do believe that people who haven't contributed to our society through the tax system, the mechanism you've implemented is designed to do that. One could argue, and I could get into a debate over like how big that tax should be, because I've got some ideas that I think it's a little too high and it's driving away any foreign money. But we won't spend time on that for a moment because I want to go back to the example of the home across the street. Now, when a home is, when we go and do our annual property tax designation, there's a declaration, right? I filled mine out earlier this year. You have to claim whether or not this is a principal residence. Now, if these people are or they're just not declaring. If you don't declare, I mean, especially if the home's empty, you're not even checking your mail, that's the way in which you get them, right? I mean, you start taxing them, which I think was great. So someone who declares, well, yeah, no, I'm a satellite family, they pay 2% a year. You're collecting now income from them that they otherwise wouldn't be contributing. That all makes sense. What I'm talking about here is what about a family who's just like, you know what? I cheated the system getting my money in the country in the first place. I laundered it through a casino or whatever.
Yeah.
So, people of that standard are going to go to them, what's the risk? Might as well just say, yeah, you know what? I'm not a satellite family. I own this place, or my son owns this place. How do we know that that's not being, missed and through the system?
It's a really straightforward check for this because you have the social insurance number of the person who's the declared owner, and you check it against the taxes that have been paid in British Columbia, and then against the value of the property and when it was purchased. And so there is an audit team that works within Ministry of Finance to do that work.
Okay, so that's being done at the provincial level?
That's being done at the provincial level around our speculation tax. At the federal level, they have access to the same information through an information sharing agreement with the province.
Okay.
So they can also access that information. The red flags around broader worldwide income declarations are those declarations being made. You may not have to pay tax on them, but you have to declare them to Revenue Canada. So there are penalties under the speculation tax. There are penalties under Revenue Canada's pieces. And also I want to flag for people in Vancouver that there's a municipal vacancy tax as well, which is different.
Yeah.
And so that also could potentially apply.
Yeah, you're talking about the Vancouver empty homes tax.
That's right.
That applies to Vancouver proper.
That's right.
So does the Ministry of Finance today, now that this social insurance number, these social insurance numbers have been submitted,
yes,
because I think that was part of the declaration form, right?
Yeah.
And if you didn't have a social insurance number, then what you just said, you don't have one and you're a foreign, how would that work?
Well, if you don't have one, then you're not paying tax in Canada, then you're automatically subject to the tax.
You're automatically subject, okay.
I think the bigger vulnerability is really rentals. So where you say, I'm renting it to somebody, because it's people hopefully will be alive to the fact it's very easy to check whether they paid taxes here or not. I'm renting it to somebody, and so I think that'll be the more challenging area around ensuring that it's rented to someone arm's length and so on.
And I think on the declaration form, there was a section about renting, and do you have to actually declare the name of the individual, or do you know any of those details?
You need to declare that it's rented. It needs to be rented for market rate, and you need to declare the rent as income.
As income.
Yeah.
But as far as, do you have to name the person as to who you're renting to?
I don't believe you do, no.
No. So that's where it can be abused.
Yeah.
Because you could just write out, I'm renting to, John Wayne, and,
I don't think it requires you to declare the person's name.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So one of the questions I have about this, because there are, I'm sure, in my neighborhood, right, in my 2-block radius, because there's just so many empty homes, either you guys are raking it in tax-wise, because these are very high-end homes. Some of these homes are north of $10-15 million assessed values, or they're either lying about the rent, or they're just saying that, declaring that they actually live in this residence or they live in this location. Maybe they have a the 19-year-old UBC student that bought the $36 million home. How come there's no kind of whistleblower program? Wouldn't that make sense that the province have some kind of program so that a guy like me can feel safe in knowing that, if I am going to so-called squeal on my neighbors, I'm not going to have to, because I talked to the city of Vancouver also doesn't have one. They basically told me, well, just call us up and give us the details. I'm like, well, I don't know if I want to do that, What if my neighbor gets really pissed at me?
Yeah, I don't. We do certainly, if people have information about tax fraud, they certainly should call the provincial government and share that information with the Ministry of Finance. But I agree with you. I don't think we have a program that's like a Crime Stoppers kind of program like I think Revenue Canada does. Yeah. That's a good suggestion. I think there's an opportunity there for sure. The reality is, I think on the ground that there are enough kind of obvious issues with declarations that may have been made that it'll keep the auditors busy for a while. But certainly if there are sort of issues with, I know, for example, and this is more on the commercial side, on 10th Avenue, there are a number of vacant stores, and it leads to problems with rats and with there was a fire in one of the stores. And so, these kinds of problems that come with vacant properties in the University Endowment lands, there are some issues with residential properties around that as well. Then they might be more prioritized. So if there are issues like that, people should definitely call up. And
do you feel that the province is equipped at this point to actually oversee such a huge new project as far as the auditors are concerned? Yeah.
Not to the level that I would like. This is very new. So we've been in power for a couple of years. The tax took a while to prepare and implement, and this is the first full year of implementation, the first full year of fiscal implementation. So it'll take some time to ramp it up.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about Revenue Canada. I mean, I feel like they're more alive now to the issues around this, but they're still not where they should be either. And so there's lots of space for us to do more on this and to do a better job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the province and Revenue Canada have a information sharing agreement.
Yeah, there are new information sharing agreements with the province.
So going back to my example of the street, the home across the street, let's say they did make a declaration, or they've got this sort of bogus rental arrangement.
Yes.
And I call them out on it. I don't care about the whistleblower, but I just tell you my MLA, hey, I think you should flag this house. You run it up the flagpole to somebody in the audit team, and they go and pull it, and let's say they see, okay, there is a social insurance number. Are they able to actually get the information from CRA as to how much declared income that person's had?
Yeah, so historically, the province and the feds have been able to share information because the feds collect tax on behalf of the province, and they do that administration for the province. And so that information does get shared. The new information sharing is more in relation to the real estate piece and the speculation tax information and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So it's information that's now available more to federal regulators as well.
Okay.
And this is something that we're looking at doing more on the money laundering front as well.
And
vice versa.
Feds. Okay.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
And also on the money laundering.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, one other item I want to talk to you about, and it's just before we started, you mentioned that you hadn't seen this before, so but this is the document you got in front of you.
Well, I've seen the bill. I saw it was when it was in the House, but
Okay.
But I didn't focus on this
so
section.
This piece I thought was interesting because there's obviously a series of exemptions in the speculation and vacancy tax, but this particular item caught my attention because it's actually just before the exemptions under what is defined as a principal residence. Now, in CRA's definition of a principal residence is really straightforward. One can only have one principal residence, and even a couple can't have two principal residences because, as you know, when you own a principal residence, whatever gains you make on that home over the life of owning it is tax-free, is it tax exempt.
Yes.
And so CRA doesn't want to have you and your wife or my wife to own two different homes.
That's right.
Okay. But you guys have gone in here and you've actually said there is a circumstance under which an individual can have a second residence.
Yeah, and this wouldn't apply to the capital gains rules
no,
federally.
This
is
is
solely
not
for the
federal.
speculation tax. Yes.
This is specifically for this speculation tax. But what caught my attention, and it applies around, just to read this here, basically it says that the principal residence of one spouse is located on Vancouver Island, and the principal residence of the other spouse is not. That's that's this part right there.
Yeah.
And then it says, or it can meet the other criteria, which is that you could have effectively two properties on Vancouver Island as long as the two properties are at least 100 kilometers apart from each other.
That's right.
Now, David, my cynical part of me is looking at this and saying, and I noticed that there wasn't any one NDP Green or Liberal MLA that spoke up against this piece.
Right.
And I thought, why would they have targeted specifically Vancouver Island and talking about individuals who the spouse has to go somewhere else for work, because that's where it says is considered to have a principal residence for enable one of them to carry on business or work in a particular location.
That's right.
And the cynical side of me, and this is not a knock at you personally, but maybe you can speak to the group of all MLAs, is it seems to me like this was like an exemption for MLAs. It was like, okay, well, many of us will be in other parts of the province. You're here in the Lower Mainland. You've got people up north, out east. And so we should be able to own a home in Victoria and own a home in our own home community and not have to pay the vacancy or speculation tax on our place in Victoria. I mean, that's effectively how I read this.
Well, I can give a generous read to your understanding of it and say that almost certainly MLAs could immediately think of not just MLAs, but public servants and others that are back and forth between Vancouver Island and the mainland on a regular basis. So that may be why there weren't questions. People could immediately think of 5 or 6 people that are doing that, right? And they could think, well, those aren't the people that we're trying to target here.
Yeah.
So let's just go through the section.
Okay.
And so it's Section A is a requirement. So you have to have business or work in a particular location that requires the spouses to live separate and apart.
Yeah.
So that's a requirement.
Yeah.
And then the second is either of the following applies. One is Vancouver Island and the resident of the other spouse is not.
Yeah. And
I think the reason why that's separate is if you look at the second section, it talks about the location being at least 100 kilometers less than the distance between the principal residence and that particular location. If you go on Vancouver Island, from Vancouver Island to the mainland or to the Sunshine Coast, or it may be less than 100 kilometers.
Right.
So it's a scenario where, although you're closer than 100 kilometers,
logistically
with the ferries and everything else, it's so the idea is simply that where someone has to work remotely and they have to live away from home for work, and they buy a place in order to facilitate that's not what we were trying to capture with the speculation tax.
Okay, so this isn't designed uniquely for, I'm just curious as to why it said Vancouver Island, but you're pointing out that item number 2 is the distance that the principal residence of the spouse and the one carrying on business is at least 100 kilometers apart. So if you're Jimmy Pattison and you've got your palace home here and you got your palace home in Kelowna, and legitimately the guy's got, he's probably got lots of homes in BC.
Right.
Who knows, with the public registry, we'll eventually find out. I don't know.
Yeah.
But if he has to travel more than 100 kilometers, he should be able to have, or his wife has a home, and she has the home here. He declares that's his home in Kelowna because he's got a bunch of...
He's got work there. He's got a
car
car dealership there. Yeah, sure.
Grocery store and whatever else he owns.
Yeah.
Is that the idea behind this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the idea behind it was necessarily Jimmy Pattison. The idea was that this is a big province, a lot of people, and it's a dispersed province, and so a lot of people have to travel for work. It's not unusual for people to buy a place where they work in some circumstances, and so that we didn't want to capture those folks in the bill. That wasn't the activity that we were hoping to get.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. How are we doing for time? Because I know you guys are we would have about a half an hour. How are we doing right now? I didn't actually check.
We're at 26, so maybe, I don't know, the last thing would be
10 minutes. 10 minutes. Because I do want to touch on what I think you'd like to as well, is the public registry. Before we do that, let's talk about the school tax, because these damn signs are all over our neighborhood. I don't have one in my front of my house, of course, you know that. But you see these big red signs. They talk about the Eby tax, and and this is around the school tax. One of the things, and just to give you guys credit, and I'm not here to just pump your tires, as you know. I mean, I'm just as, I have critical things as much as I have, but I want to say one thing I really appreciate the NDP has done is, and you can value this because you have a young child like myself, is the number of schools that have these decrepit old playgrounds. And in fact, for health reasons, for safety reasons, a lot of the school districts like Vancouver have been tearing these school playgrounds down. General Brock Elementary School, which is an inner city school that my niece and nephew have been going to for years. My niece hasn't had a playground up until this last year for like 3-4 years because it was like a 40-year-old playground that apparently isn't suitable anymore. I mean, we got through it, but I mean that's another
broken bones.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But you guys came out with a policy. I don't even remember this. That you guys came out with a policy. I think you put a program where you've put $3 million at work to build new schools for school playgrounds for schools because the school boards don't cover that.
That's right.
And I thought it was really great. I mean, someone who
like kind of a basic thing, right?
It's a basic. Like imagine going to your school and there's no playground in the country we live in with everything we have, all the resources we have. So anyways, I want to just compliment you guys on that.
Yeah, it's a good policy.
I think it's a great policy. And I'm really glad you guys have done that because what I think it shows is that you guys, you could have easily pointed the finger back at the Vancouver school board or the other school boards and say, no, you guys got to make this part of your agenda and put it in your budget and take cut from other places. But instead of doing that, you guys just said, let's just fix the problem right away. And that's something I do really appreciate. So thank you for doing that.
Right on.
But I do want to talk about the school tax because to me, what it is just a high value home tax. It's just an additional, and we're talking about it's actually coined the additional school tax.
Yes.
So this is the 0.2% additional tax on the value of a home exceeding $3 million but below $4 million.
Yeah.
And then from $4 million and above, it goes to 40 basis points.
Yeah, 0.4.
0.4%. And you guys call it a school tax, yet there's no specific wording that says this money is going to go directly back into this particular school or to schools in general. Mm-hmm. I know on your website you state that, we spend way more on schools than we get in funding. But you could make the same claim about many things, whether it's roads, whether it's health, the health system.
Yep.
So I'm really I want to know why you guys decided to call this a school tax, because I feel, and of course the neighbors too, don't feel like it's a school tax. I think you just call it what it is, which is a high value home tax.
Yeah. Well, two pieces. I mean, frankly, I wish we'd called it something else too. The school tax has been around for a long time. It's the provincial portion of the property tax that people pay.
Yeah.
The additional school tax is the new initiative, and it was called the additional school tax because that's what it was. I guess that seemed like sort of the appropriate name. I agree. I mean, but I'm not sure that people would like it any better if it was called the high value home property tax, right? I just don't think that they would. I think now, in terms of schools themselves, we've increased spending on schools by about $1 billion, and that the increased revenue from the additional school tax is significantly less than $1 billion. So people say, "Oh, well, you haven't put it into schools." You could have, and maybe it would have been a good idea for finance to put that provision into law and say it has to be put into schools, but it wouldn't change any situation on the ground because we've vastly exceeded the amount of money taken through the school tax in terms of additional new funding for schools for various things, including playgrounds that we were just talking about. I think that the core of it is when I talk to people in terms of their objection, it's not the name. It's not that the funding isn't, these are objections that people have, but the real objection is, look, I bought this house 30 years ago. I'm a social worker. I didn't make a ton of money. I scrimped and saved to buy this place. And then a bunch of speculators and investors and money launderers bought up property around me. It's not my fault.
Right.
And I don't
want to,
I don't want to move.
Yeah.
I like my house. And now you're saying I have to pay, my house is now worth $15 million. And so I have to pay an extra, and some of the bills are quite significant when you get to 0.2 and 0.4 on a $15 million home. Yeah. And so those are really difficult conversations in terms of that objection for me, because, from the perspective of these folks, they're no better off really. Like, they're still living on their income that they earned. And just because their house is worth $15 million doesn't mean they have $15 million in the bank to live on and living the high life, right?
In our industry, we call asset rich, cash poor.
Yeah. So, and yet at the same time, that is driving a massive gap between the wealthiest people in our society, which they are, and everybody else.
Yeah.
And that growing gap is a public policy issue because it breeds a bunch of issues.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do you recognize the fact that the individual is worth $15 million in reality, and yet simultaneously they feel like they aren't worth $15 million? And I think that gap has been a big challenge. There is no way for me to either convince the finance minister if she changed the name or if she dedicated it to schools that people would suddenly feel that was okay.
Yeah.
I think the reality is around this gap between the winners and a lot of losers in the housing market.
Sure.
And even if people don't feel like winners because they lost their neighborhoods and there are vacant homes around them and that kind of thing, financially, they are. And so that is a big challenge for sure.
Yeah, I understand. That makes sense. It makes sense. Can individuals who are on a fixed income, maybe they're not even late stage in their retirement, but just early stage, are they able to defer the tax? Are they able to do that to the province?
Yeah. So there are mitigating pieces, and one of them is that the province subsidizes a program where people can defer the taxes and pay them when they sell their home. Yeah. Now people say, "Oh, I don't want to borrow. It feels like I'm selling off my home bit by bit." The tax is a fraction of the appreciation of the value of the homes over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Even, and so. It's harder for me when I leave the neighborhood to explain why it is that we're subsidizing the ability of this group of very wealthy people to defer their taxes when other people in the province don't get to do that.
Right.
And that's a harder conversation, actually. So I try to tell people, it's actually quite a good program, but it's in the context of a much more difficult conversation, obviously.
Yeah, it's not an easy one. Well, hopefully maybe this podcast helps explain that a little easier for people who don't get it. I mean, I get it. I'm not in those people's situation. I'm a working individual, so I can pay the added tax, and I like to know that the money's going towards school. So I did like seeing you guys support, say, for example, that playground item. I don't like paying tax as anybody else, but it's a requirement for our society. There's other things that if we had more time, we could talk about Trade and Invest BC. The central deposit program. There's lots of ways in which you as a government could also be doing better as far as cutting costs for the province, but we don't have time for that. So that's a good answer. Thanks for that, David. Let's just, because we are limited on time, let's go into this beneficial ownership / public registry. Do you want to just high level for listeners that maybe have never heard about this before? Because this is coming, right? This is coming in the fall?
That's right.
Okay.
It'll start with new purchases and it'll move into all existing homes.
Okay.
We have a land title registry that has, it should have, a list of all of the owners of all the real estate in the province. So if you have a business with a piece of property, or if you slip and fall on a piece of property or whatever, you can look up the address and you can find out who the owner is. And the challenge that we have with that is that a significant and growing portion of the residential property market, especially at the high end, is owned by numbered companies or trusts or offshore trusts, offshore companies, where it's impossible to determine who the actual owner is. And the result of that is that our real estate market acts as a shield for people who want to put money in and conceal the fact that they're the source of the money. So what we would like to do with this beneficial ownership registry is require that the actual owner, the source of the funds that's going into the property, is declared in a public registry. And it's a public registry for a couple of reasons. The first is that British Columbia doesn't necessarily know that somebody came from some country halfway around the world where they siphoned a bunch of money out of the government banks and then put it into real estate into Vancouver. We just don't know that. And so if it's public, it creates the possibility for law enforcement in other jurisdictions to find that person.
Right.
And to find that they put money into Vancouver real estate. And the second piece is for local issues. It's important to ask any journalist. It's critically important for them to be able to do the work to follow the money, to do public accountability work, for watchdogs to do public accountability work in terms of our real estate market. And just to give you an idea about the scope of the problem, Transparency International Canada found that half of the most valuable residential properties in British Columbia, the vast majority of which are in the community that we live in, the west side of Vancouver, for half of those, it was almost half, it was impossible to figure out who owned those properties. And so we know that people are putting money in using mechanisms to deliberately conceal who the actual owner is. And for a number of reasons, tax enforcement, law enforcement, and general accountability, we think that it would be better if British Columbia led the way in requiring them to disclose who owns it. Okay,
good. So that's great intro or summary of that. Thank you. That's in layman's terms of what I was looking for. So let me ask you a couple pointed questions on this. So maybe I'll start by making a statement. So in the neighborhood that we live in, I often hear people say, "Oh, it's those mainland Chinese that have driven up prices. They're the ones," and other people say, "This it's money launderers." And my view is there's probably a number of factors. I actually think the biggest underlying factor is that we've had all-time low interest rates and all-time low cost of borrowing debt for over a decade, since the financial crisis. So people have been leveraging up their balance sheets personally all across the country, and it's well documented. So I actually think that's the biggest driving force. But what I like about what you guys are doing with this model is you're going to be able to either validate or dispel this myth that is foreign money and money laundering that has driven up prices. Because you and I actually don't know right now. Right, we can make a guess based on walk around our neighborhood, like I am, and seeing that
there's a shocking lack of data on one of our biggest drivers of the economy.
Exactly. Yeah. And for a person who works in the securities industry, as we said just before we started filming, the real estate industry's requirements for disclosure of beneficial ownership and AML, anti-money laundering, is like way down here, and in my industry, it's like way up here. So people in my industry think it's a bit of a joke. Like there's the real estate people are up in arms over this thing, because to me, we've been having to do this for years in the securities industry. I mean, if you want to open an account to buy some shares in Royal Bank, you have to virtually give your left arm just to be able to open an account. So I get that, and I think it's a great idea. But it's a double-edged sword, because the problem is now you're looking like Big Brother, big government, snooping into my privacy. And if you're making it a public registry, now we're talking about security risk. Again, use Jimmy Pattison. He's one of the wealthiest people, probably the wealthiest person in BC. It sounds to me the way this public registry is going to work is it's not like the land titles website where you actually have to pay $7.50 or $12 for every title you want to do a search on, which would be prohibitive for people to do generally massive searches. But it sounds the way you guys are going to roll this out is it's literally open for everybody to dial in and see what you own and what I own and what Ross owns. And I'm just wondering about how do you guys stick handle this, because there's a risk here to individuals of knowing who owns what homes and where I live.
Yeah, so my preference around the data for real estate generally is that it be free and open and accessible. And there is a really important policy issue that you raised. So you've got prosecutors doing gang crime work. You've got police officers doing undercover work or anti-organized crime work. You've got a woman fleeing an abusive husband.
Right.
You've got a pop star who has 15 different stalkers. There are several different categories of individuals that you can think of that although there is a public interest in having broad access to information, there is a significant private interest in maintaining their safety. And so the Act creates the possibility for a person to say, look, here's who I am, government. Now that I own this property. But there is a significant public interest in my safety. We want to keep people safe. And I'm under threat from this and this and this. And so it is possible for people to not have their names included in the database.
Okay. But
they still have to make the declaration to government so that government, for the purposes of regulation, tax authority, policing, and so on, can follow the money, even if you're famous, even if you're a police officer or a judge, that authorities are still able to review that information.
Okay. Well, that's great. I didn't know that. That's excellent. So can a person like myself make that? I mean, I'm not a pop star. I'm not a politician like you. But I run a Bitcoin business, and there's a lot of bad actors in that space, as I've told you about. And I sure as heck wouldn't want some of those people, some of those criminals, to know where I live.
Right. So there is a test that'll be administered by the public servants that are responsible for the registry. It'll be the same folks that do the land title registry, and they're creating policy for who qualifies for the exemption and who doesn't. And so you would make that application that shows that you have some sort of specific concern that someone was threatening you. And then ideally you'd have some sort of supporting documentation around police reports and so on.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. Okay. So it would have to be you have a pretty strict criteria.
Yeah, because the focus is on openness around this registry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're just a super highly wealthy individual that's not really in the limelight, you're just a CEO of a boring company that your family's had for 2 generations, and you're worth $50 million. Those people could have their name registered for their $30 million home in the area that we live in.
Absolutely. And frankly, the vast majority of British Columbians do. Already have their property under their real name, which is searchable under a database. And
Okay, great. This is great, David. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'd love
Congratulations on the podcast. I wish you luck with it.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to have you come in again, because we didn't even get to jump on the money laundering, which is an area that you and I've talked about, and I see on the ground level some of the activity that goes on there. So I like the work you guys are doing. I'm not totally happy with the last report, because it was based on some very big data from, I think it was the IMF, but we don't have time to talk about it today. But let's have you come back in another time and maybe talk, especially as you guys get more more progress over the next little while.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Dave.
Excellent.
Okay.
Right on.
Appreciate it.